And since I really want to get off this stage very quickly, I'd like to introduce you to the first featured speaker for today, geopolitical strategist Peter Zeihan. Peter is a global energy, demographic, and security expert. His worldwide view marries the realities of geography and populations to a deep understanding of how global politics impact markets and economic trends, helping industry leaders navigate today's complex mix of geopolitical risks and opportunities. In 2012, Peter founded his own firm, Zeihan on Geopolitics, in order to provide a select group of clients with direct, custom analytical products. Today, these clients represent a vast array of sectors, including energy majors, financial institutions, business associations, agricultural interests, universities, and the U.S. military. Many may remember Parag Khanna at our conference in 2016. Parag discussed the idea that we are accelerating into a future shaped less by countries and more by connectivity. In Peter's most recent book, The Absent Superpower, he explores what happens when one country does not rely upon that connectivity. With the shale oil revolution, the U.S. will soon be energy independent, and with that, have little need and even less desire to engage with the rest of the world. We have already seen a little of this take place on Twitter. Please welcome Peter Zeihan to the stage, and let's learn what happens next.
All right. Thank you much. Good morning, everyone. Where are my Texans? A little quiet this morning. I guess the elevation's getting to you, huh? I love Texans. I love Texas. Never had an opportunity to live there. I mean, I was in Austin for 20 years, but we all know that doesn't quite count. It's important to remember that just as Texas is really not, or Austin is really not part of Texas, the United States really isn't part of the world. But to really unpack that, we got to take a step back. This is how we used to trade. We didn't trade goods, we traded ammo. And if you saw something that you thought you needed, you went out and you took the damn thing. You confiscated it, you colonized it, you expanded into empire. And those empires clashed over resources and access and markets, and those clashes brought us wars, and those wars ultimately brought us to World War II, which took the entire system and made it crash. Now, at the end of that war, the Americans drew their allies together and tried something new. We said, instead of everyone having a sequestered imperial economic system that they guarded with their own navies, the US Navy, the only one to survive the war, would patrol the global oceans for everyone so that anyone could go anywhere at any time and purchase any raw commodity, ship it home safely, metabolize it into a finished good, and then export it for hard currency. There was just one catch. You had to be on our side. We bribed up an alliance to fight the Cold War. And it gave us this map. The deep blue are the countries that the Americans cared about before the war. The medium blue, those were the new allies in this new global order, the first global order. The light blue was the field of competition, and the orange were the other guys. We don't like to talk about them. And it worked. But then one idle Tuesday, in the very definition of pent-up demand, it was all over. When the wall fell, we didn't have a concept for what to do next. It had never occurred to us that the Cold War could end in anything other than thermonuclear destruction. And almost overnight, our view of the world changed. There's a lot of gray up there, a lot of places that Americans just don't have a firm opinion on. Now, the person who was in charge at this moment of change when the wall fell was George Herbert Walker Bush, who from a foreign policy point of view is arguably the best president that the United States has ever had. He certainly had the experience, been ambassador to China, ran the Office of Budget, was VP, ran the CIA, served in Congress, had an excellent working relationship with everyone around the world who mattered, had a first-name relationship with everyone on both sides of the political aisle at home. He was the right person at the right time with the right mindset and the right Rolodex and the right expertise to lead us into a new era. So of course we voted him out of office. And we started down the parade of morons. Bill Clinton, arguably the smartest person to inhabit the Oval Office since Jefferson. But he had how should I put this, an attention deficit issue. He also saw himself as a domestic president, a leader of domestic renewal. He found foreign policy boring. Now, whenever he found out that there was going to be a summit the following day, he kind of crammed for the test with the CIA desk officer and the State Department folks. And he would hit it out of the park every single time. But there'd be no follow-up. So for 8 years, we really only had about 2 months of foreign policy. Let's call it what it was. We had a monochromatic foreign policy that dealt with one issue in one region. And then we had President Obama, Obama was a weird cat. He gave a series of kind of exit interviews with the press in his final year as president, where he demonstrated a command of the context and the details of the international system that I have never seen out of an elected leader, not even out of Herbert Walker Bush. You know, why green technologies won't work in their current form, why the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will never end, why the Russians do what they do. But for an American leader, for any leader, Obama had a weird personality quirk. He hated people. No American president went to Capitol Hill or even met with his own cabinet secretaries fewer times than Barack Obama. Well, with the exception of President Harrison. You guys remember him? He caught pneumonia during his inauguration speech and then died on day like 30. Obama beats him. But that's it. And so for 8 years, we didn't have foreign policy at all. And the world got strange. Just as making choices has consequences, refusing to make a choice has consequences. And for 3 straight presidents, this country refused to have a conversation with itself about what sort of world we wanted to live in. What was our goal? What did we want? We were on strategic drift, which meant that the global order, which was created to fight a war that ended 30 years ago, was always on borrowed time. And now, it is finally giving way. And that's okay, because we never used it. The global order was designed to fight a war. It was a bribe, and so the United States never invested its economy into it. We are the least involved economy in the world as a percent of GDP. Last year, only about 8% of GDP came from exports. About half of that is within the NAFTA system. The United States can and is and will have a regional order without needing a global one. That gets really interesting really quick. Now, this is how most Americans see themselves. We're the pioneers heading out west. It was the greatest cultural and economic expansion in human history, and it lasted for 150 years. We see this as our norm. Things can, will, should, are God ordained to get better every single year. But we all know that that's not how it always happens. Sometimes the world reaches out and punches you in the face. And because of this backdrop, this cultural formative experience, we don't deal with that well. And so when the world does reach out and touch us in ways we don't like, we overreact, we panic. And if you're looking for someone to blame for why we're kind of flipping and flopping and manic depressive as a culture, well, I blame Canada. Because back in the War of 1812, they burned our capital down. That was just rude. It's like, yeah. The Brits officially did it. They drove the carpool, but it was Canadian Marines from Toronto. And this started us on this weird path where we get shocked and we overreact and we're convinced that the world is going to end and we reinvent ourselves. So Sputnik is probably the quintessential example. Let's be honest here, folks. It was a beeping aluminum grapefruit. It was not a big deal. But we were convinced that we had already lost the Cold War, even though we were ahead in rocketry and electronics and metallurgy. Our overreaction to Sputnik forced us to completely overhaul our educational and manufacturing systems, and we coasted on that for the next 50 years. Vietnam's another great example. We lost a post-colonial war to a rice producer, and it wasn't even our colony, and we were the world's largest rice exporter at the time. Our overreaction to the Vietnam defeat pushed through the revolution in military affairs, which brought us everything from cell phones to cruise missiles, which are still the backbone of our economic and military system today. The most recent time that we got hit was 9/11. Tragedy by any measure, 3,000 dead. We now have the sharp end of American power on either side of every trade and energy artery on the planet. And I hate to say it, folks, it's been a while since 9/11. We're due for another shock. And since we're the ones that maintain the global order, and yet we don't use it, that's more a problem for everyone else than it is for us. Because think about what you need to maintain a global order. Well, first of all, you need a consumption base. So let's talk demography. Now, this is a standard demographic profile. Children at the bottom, young adults, mature adults, retirees at the top, men on one side, women on the other. Simple mortality builds it into a pyramid. Now, this is Mexico. This is an ideal demography, lots of young people. Whenever you've got a bulge in your demography below roughly age 40, it's all about the spending. Kids, cars, college, homes, pot, spend. But they're new. Their income has yet to expand to match their needs, so it's college loans and car loans and mortgages. High growth, but also high debt. Now, when American policymakers look at this sort of demography, we see the perfect pairing. Because this is a country that is a lower stage of economic development. Their value-added work is not as good as ours, but there's a lot of young people to absorb goods. So the United States, more technical, Mexico, less technical, two-way trade works out very, very well. You may have noticed that over the last 2 years, Trump's, can we call it a rant? Yeah, Trump's rants against Mexico have largely dropped the trade issue because it wasn't resonating. Mexico is a partner, not a problem. That's not the case in Canada. Canada had a baby bust back in the early 1970s. They never recovered. Now they've got a surge of population in that mature worker demographic. This makes them capital rich. All these people are saving for retirement, but they're not consuming anymore because the kids have moved out. Which means that they are competing in the same industries that the United States does well in. And because there's no consumption down there, nobody in their 20s and 30s, they have to export everything they produce. So you've got a super saturated labor market in that advanced state, which pushes down the cost of the goods that they produce. American policymakers see this as a problem. Canada is no longer a partner, it's a competitor. And if you can't get your birth rate back up, eventually you age into something like Japan. Now, Japan has an interesting problem. How do you run a first world economy without a workforce? You automate. Funny thing about robots, they don't vote yet, which means it doesn't matter where you put them. So Japan has become the world leader not in outsourcing or in resourcing, but in desourcing, picking up entire chunks of their industrial plant and dropping them in other countries on the other side of political and currency risk. Build where you sell. Here's the United States. Kind of in the middle, kind of a chimney. Now there's two demographic groups here we need to talk about. The first, right up here at the top, these are the baby boomers. It's the largest generation as a percentage of the population in American history. And their concentration in that capital-rich demographic has made the United States capital-rich. Exorbitantly capital-rich, unprecedentedly capital-rich. Too capital-rich. Because all of that money seeking this limited number of investment opportunities has pushed down the cost of capital in the United States. Led them to invest in projects that in retrospect maybe weren't the best idea. This is BRIC, this is subprime, this is Enron, this is disco. None of this should have ever happened. And in the year 2022, the majority of the American boomers will have moved into retirement. And all of those prospective investments will be liquidated, and all the cash will be brought home where it's not going to be in stocks and bonds, it's going to be in T-bills, or literally cash, because they won't be able to take the volatility. The availability of capital will collapse. The velocity of capital won't slow, won't stop, it'll reverse, which means the cost of capital will at least quadruple in just 3 years. Next generation, down here we've got the millennials. Now with your Young Leaders Forum here, I gotta say, I am pleased to see so many millennials in the audience today who are awake. Normally I like to spend about 20, 30 minutes of every presentation talking about why the millennials are a waste of skin. We don't have that kind of time today. So instead we're gonna focus on the positive, why we should all be horrendously grateful for the millennials. This won't take nearly as long, there's only 3 reasons. Number 1, consumption. All that filet mignon dog food and all those juice bar memberships and all those goddamn scooters, they add up. Millennial consumption has kept the United States out of recession since 2009, and they are young enough and there's enough of them that consumption pulse has at least another 4 years to run. That is phenomenal. It doesn't make us recession proof, but wow, does it give us a lot of ballast. Second, if you fast forward to the year 2030 when the millennials are in charge, they will fill out the tax-paying class in a way that my generation, Gen X, never could. So there is a light at the end of the fiscal tunnel. It is not a train, it's a millennial. Whether that makes you very happy or very sad is up to you. Third, in the United States, we think of the millennials as the end-all and the be-all, as the alpha and the omega. But really, they're all alone in the night. Almost every other country on the planet had a baby bust on the Canadian scale at about the same time. And if you look at the rich world demography without the Americans in it, it's an old folks' home. The global system today is based on expanding consumption of first the developed and then the developing world. That will no longer work, even if the United States remains engaged. There's no one who can step into the American shoes. People like to talk about the Chinese, but hello, remember the one-child policy? Well, 25 years after the one-child policy, the Chinese are running out of 25-year-olds. They're not nearly as good at math as they'd have us all believe. What about elsewhere in Asia? Koreans are just as bad. So are the Thais. Let's switch continents. Here's Germany. You want to talk about a country that can't have an open, honest conversation about population policy, and it has an impact. Let's go south. You know, if there's any country in the world that has cracked the code on how to have kids, it should be Italy. It's not any better in Spain. Moving over into New Europe, Poland looks pretty bad too. And then the Russians, assuming these numbers are accurate, because they tend to lie about, statistics, the Russians are flat out dying out. Brazil, there we go, country of the future, right? This is where we put our hope. Look at the number at the top of this chart. This is Brazil in 1990. Here's Brazil today. Brazil is aging at 6 times the American rate. They will be old long before they become rich. In fact, the average American will be younger than the average Brazilian by the year 2042. The average American is already younger than the average Chinese citizen. There's really only one place on the planet that has young people in any volume, and that's Mexico. But you'll notice those 4 bottom bars, how it kind of drops straight down. The baby bust, 30 years late, has arrived in Mexico. Now we're well before the point of no return. This could still turn around. But Mexican imports, labor imports in the United States have been negative for 10 years running now. So your only option is to go further south into Central America and, arrange a convoy. In fact, aside from the United States, there's only 2 countries on the planet that have sustainable demographies. And while the French can manage the catering and the Kiwis can man the bar, a global system that does not make. This system was on borrowed time before the United States decided to back away. And that's just the first piece. Without consumption, there's no global order. But there's something else you need. Security. The global system requires a military power to hold it together. And without that, these are the zones that are likely to see the greatest disruption moving forward. Because these are the zones that have seen the greatest civilizational tectonic plate action, if you want to put it that way, over the last millennia. The one exception is under the global order, where the Americans forced everybody to be on the same side. But you remove the Americans from that equation, and history restarts. These are the places that have seen the greatest economic growth, and it's largely a base effect because we removed security from the equation. We're just going back to the norms. Now, the person you need to watch most is not Donald Trump. I mean, don't get me wrong, he's entertaining. But this is the guy who's making the real decisions. This is Robert Lighthizer. He's the US Trade Representative, and he is responsible for the negotiation and enforcement of every trade deal on the books in the United States. He's been a very busy boy of late. Now, this is not his first stint in government. Lighthizer used to work for Reagan. You guys remember the Plaza Accords, 1985? Quick war story. So back during the first Reagan term, the Reagan administration noticed that a lot of the allies were doing things that we weren't really fans of. For example, the French, the Germans, the Brits, the Japanese, they were all intervening in currency markets, pushing down the cost of their currency in order to boost exports to the American system. Reagan saw this, found it distasteful, but the Cold War was running hot and heavy. He didn't want to rock the boat. He needed the allies all lined up on security issues. So he looked the other way. But by the time we got to 1984, things had changed. Reagan would never face another election. Gorbachev was rising to power, and the Cold War was warming up. So the Reagan team pulled the allies together at the Plaza Hotel in New York and says, look, we see what you're doing. You're going to stop. You're going to stop today, because if you don't, we will pull out of the global order, and you can deal with the Russians by yourself, because we now have a side deal. It worked. The intervention didn't just stop, it reversed. Within 6 months, the US dollar had dropped by half. Lighthizer was the Reagan administration's hatchet man assigned to Tokyo to make sure the Japanese did not renege on the deal. And whenever he got his marching orders, he would walk into the Ministry of Finance, lay out the American position, and then when the Japanese were issuing the rebuttal, he would take off his translator microphone, disassemble it on the desk in front of him, have a little G.I. Joe with the war with the pieces, pew, pew. When the Japanese were done, he'd reassemble it, put it back on, and say, well, that was absolutely riveting, but we're going to do it my way, right? He doesn't negotiate, he imposes. He makes sure that he holds all the cards, and then he just goes. So far, he has concluded deals with South Korea, with Mexico, with Canada, with Japan, and will probably have a bare bones, if not a complete deal with the United Kingdom done by the end of the year. Those 5 are all the United States is concerned with, because those 5 represent a majority of the American trade portfolio. There is not going to be a deal with China. There is not going to be a deal with Europe, which means the tariff levels that are in place today are the new floor for international trade. No order, and if you don't have a specific deal with the United States, no security. And that's just the start of the conversation. There are 4 big tools that Lighthizer is bringing to bear. Number 1, energy. The United States becomes a net oil exporter this year. It is already a net exporter of every other energy product that humans use. I urge you to think of stability in the international energy markets as no longer in American interests. Because in an environment where the global system is disrupted, the United States is not. And it gives every American corporate power a competitive leg up on everybody else. I strongly urge you to look at American foreign policy in places like Iran and Venezuela in that light. Disruption is now good for business. Next up, steel and aluminum and automotive. For those of you who have been following the trade talks, you may have noticed that these details, steel, aluminum, automotive, are not included in any of the trade deals. That is so Lighthizer has them in his back pocket, and he can pull them out at any time to shape any negotiation he wants. In addition, it's not limited to trade. Trump has them in his back pocket and uses them to force compliance on whatever issue he wants, even if it has nothing to do with goods exchange. And then finally, the currency market. Now, you guys deal with almost an exclusively dollarized product, so this is probably a little bit out of your bailiwick, but I urge you to consider how trade actually works from a currency point of view. Let's say you've got a load of Korean electronics that are being sold to the Brazilians. The Koreans do not get paid in won because nobody in Brazil has or wants won. And they don't get paid in Brazilian reals because no one in Korea has or wants reals. So what happens is the Brazilians pay in their local currency, the real. It's converted to US dollars on a secondary exchange, and then it's reconverted into won, which are given to the Koreans. It's a three-step process with the dollar in the middle. Roughly 95% of global trade uses this mechanism. Under Obama, the last round of Iran sanctions were expressly designed to interrupt that intermediate step so that individual transactions or individual corporations could be blocked. What Trump has done is taken a scalpel and turned it into a machete so that it can cut out not just companies, but countries. And these sanctions have already been threatened against NATO allies. And Lighthizer is chomping at the bit to throw that against China. Because if this tool comes into play, you don't simply lose access to the American market, you lose access to all international trade. And the biggest problem the Chinese have right now is that this is the guy in charge. Foreign policy debate within the administration right now falls into two rough camps. In camp number one, led by Lighthizer, you have a belief that the global system is flawed and out of date, and so if it has to be brought to secure some sort of national interest, so be it. In the second basket, the global order itself is seen as part of the problem and that it should be taken down regardless of what else happens. In this sort of environment, it's just a question of timing before the whole thing comes crashing down. All right, let's talk about your world more specifically. Now, this is the private capital curve. This is all private capital from all sources to all American institutions and corporations. Starts in 2000, that little bump in the middle, that's the 2007 financial crisis. We basically doubled total private credit in 7 years. That was too much, too fast, and so we had a recession. GDP fell back by about 5%. Since then, the capital curve has recovered, but at a much more sustainable rate, much more similar to the century average. Okay, this is our baseline. Same data, but instead of absolute terms, relative terms. That little bump in the middle, that's a doubling. Here's the Eurozone. In the time that we had a doubling, they had a tripling. Too much too fast, their recession hit harder, lasted longer. Some countries, Italy, still haven't recovered. Here's Greece. 7-fold increase in credit in 7 years, way too fast. The Greek economy has to this point contracted by 40%. That's more than we went through during the Great Depression. They are not done. They probably have another 20% to go. Here's Brazil. You don't have to put your hands up, but if you like soap operas or 90210 or Game of Thrones, you know, drama, you have got to look into Brazilian politics. It's just delightful. Last year, the Brazilians had a presidential election, and the two final candidates, one of them was campaigning from prison where he had been convicted of corruption. Not indicted, convicted. Love it. And the other guy, the guy who ultimately won, said that the real problem with the Nazis is that they were just too soft on their domestic opponents. Wow. Folks, this capital curve, that's what a lost decade looks like. It's not as bad as Greece, but it's still pretty bad. And that assumes that the Brazilians get the politics right. I think we should go ahead and pencil in a second lost decade for the Brazilians. This is India and Turkey. Two countries who have yet to begin their adjustments, but who have already elected ethno-nationalist leaders who think nothing of spawning a race riot at the drop of a hat in order to get a bump in the polls. And then here's the People's Republic of China, and let me just kind of bring that down for you. Oh, yeah. There are 20, 30 major reasons why I don't think China is going to be a unified state a decade from now. In your industry, this is probably the most important one. China is the most overcapitalized country in human history in both absolute and relative terms. That little hook at the top, that's what they call a capital tightening. When the money is free, when the loans are bottomless, you can bid up the price of anything because you don't care what the price is. This is one of the reasons why manufactured good prices have gone down, why raw commodity prices have gone up. Neither of those trends is sustainable. Again, before the United States pulls the rug out from the global system. Now, there are a number of things going on in the energy sector today. I want to focus specifically on things that have a lifespan of at least a couple of decades. So let's start with price. The taller the bar, the greater the cost of producing crude. The broader the bar, the greater the volume of the crude out of any particular play. Now on the far right in black, you've got the OPEC states, lots of volume, relatively low cost. On the far left, you have US shale, very expensive to produce and not a lot there. Now this is data that is dated. This is from 2012, so 7 years old. Back then, US shale cost about $90 a barrel to produce, and there's only about 4 million barrels a day of it. Strategically significant, but not really a game changer. Since then, we've had a number of breakthroughs in things like water management, data processing, drilling, and here's where we were as of the beginning of the second quarter. US shale today is almost cost competitive with Saudi Arabia, and we are dealing with an industry that is still a juvenile. So as these technologies get combined into a best practices suite, I have no doubt that the United States shale sector, writ large, will be roughly cost competitive with Saudi Arabia by the end of next year. And of course, we're already out producing Saudi Arabia, and the United States becomes a net exporter of crude this year as well. So that's our starting point. And within that one slide is a whole lot of detail. Let's start with guns. On the right, you have a jump carrier. On the left, you have a super. On the deep blue sea, without support from the land, it takes 7 jump carriers to hold their own against 1 super carrier. There are 20 jump carriers in the world. Half are American. There are 11 super carriers in the world. All are American. Which means that one American aircraft carrier battle group roughly has the same projection-based firepower as the combined navies of the rest of the planet. Now, putting this force disconnect at the service of the global commons is what makes the order work. But pulling it back means that there can't even theoretically be a global order. What is the product that by volume is shipped the most around the world? Oil. When the United States removes itself from the Persian Gulf, and we are now have fewer troops in the Gulf than at any time since the 1960s, and fewer troops stationed abroad overall than at any time since the 1920s, that means it's left to the tender mercy of the local powers to figure out who's in charge. Saudi Arabia and Iran have some strong opinions on that topic. And now managing that dispute is not our problem. It's Britain's, it's France's, it's Germany's, it's Turkey's, it's Japan's, it's China's. I don't know about you, but I can't wait to see how that shakes out. What about back home? This is a map of all the shale fields in pink. You'll notice that all of them are between the Rockies and the Appalachians, which means the American mid-continent is the most supersaturated energy market in the planet. Now, originally, we were going to have a Keystone pipeline coming down this zone. But between problems in Alberta, problems in Ottawa, and simply the price structure of the mid-continent, it isn't happening, or at least not anytime soon. So this pool of crude, the world's largest pool, isn't going anywhere. And the nature of that crude is different from your average crude blend around the world. Remember, shale production is different from traditional production. Normally, you drill down through the cap rock, you tap the pool, it all comes up. A little oversimplification, but you get the idea. That's not how it works with shale. With shale, you literally have to blast it out of the rock. So in traditional formations, the crude migrates through various rock strata, picking up impurities like sulfur and mercury along the way. With shale, that never happens. It's trapped within the rock strata at the point of formation. So it's super light and super sweet. So not only do we have a crude pool in the mid-continent, we have a very specific grade of crude pool, and that changes the math. Now ignore the colors on this, just focus where all the dots are and their size. This is every publicly traded crude stream in the world that's over 100,000 barrels per day. Now that top left corner, that's the light and the sweet stuff. All US shale has hit that section. And normally, this is what people are after because it's easy to refine. You don't need really 1990s technology to do it. 1940s technology will more or less work just fine. That's not what we've done. Because we knew as recently as 2007 that the global crude stream was getting heavier and more sour. So starting in roughly 1980, we retooled our entire industry in the refining sector to run on that heavy gunk. Here's the problem. Those purple arrows are pointing to Canadian and Venezuelan crude strains that are basically falling off the market. In Venezuela, it's because of civilizational collapse. In Alberta, it's because of price pressures. That red arrow is pointed at Mexican Mayan. One of the many, many effects of López Obrador's election in Mexico is the complete destruction of crude production out of Mexico, which means everything that we have done here to make our refineries the best in the world has turned them into paperweights. This disconnect, the light, sweet, heavy, sour disconnect, is the new normal for the industry. It is the biggest challenge that this industry faces. Luckily, the shale industry also shows a possible path forward. Now this is the checkbook map. Every dot there is somebody with a checkbook because they can afford to pay the power bill. Now this is arguably the most important city in Western civilization. This is Marshalltown, Iowa, that's where I'm from. This is Bismarck, North Dakota. Should you ever find yourself in the neighborhood, I strongly suggest you go to Fargo instead. And this is not a rave. This is the shale field of North Dakota. Now, why is it lit up? Not because anyone lives there, not because people are trying to stay warm, although that's a reasonable expectation. It's because of the transport disconnect. Now, oil's a liquid. You can put it into a bucket. You can put it into a tanker car or a rail car. And if you can't move it that day, that's fine. Just put it in an open tank. It's not going to go anywhere. It's a liquid. Can't do that with natural gas. It disperses. So you have to have a collection, a transmission, and a usage system. And that usage system has to be able to process the natural gas at the rate it comes in because storage is so difficult. Now, in the United States, we've got the world's largest, most sophisticated, most versatile natural gas distribution system. And we can't keep up with the stuff that is bubbling up out of the shale fields as a byproduct. In the United States, and only in the United States, natural gas is essentially free. What can't you do with a bottomless supply of it? Well, you can burn it for power. The blue line is average US electricity prices. You'll notice that it kind of flatlined back in 2007 when shale gas really hit the market. Even in New York, that's the orange line, it's basically gone flat to negative. Gray, there's Texas, ground zero for the shale revolution. Power prices have dropped down by about 30%. Only California, that's in yellow, escapes the trend. Because as you all know, consuming power in California is heartily encouraged, but producing it is usually illegal. But we can't burn enough of it. We're displacing coal out of the entire fuel mix, and we just can't keep up with all the stuff that's coming. So that brings us to petrochemicals. Now, you guys have seen some version of this before. On the bottom left, you start with crude oil, you refine it into naphtha, that turns into daughter products. On the bottom right, you start with natural gas, you crack the ethane to make ethylene, same general concept. Now, normally, you would only use natural gas inputs to make this relatively narrow product set, because these are the products you can only make from natural gas. And normally, natural gas in BTU terms is about 5 times the cost of crude because it's hard to produce, hard to store, hard to transport. But it's not here, which means that we are using natural gas for this product set. We are the only country in the world that now has an alternate feedstock for the bulk of our petrochemical work, which means that the United States is the premier petrochemical power, not just today, but for the remainder of this century, because these price trends have legs. They're structural. They deal with the nature of production in this country now, and they cannot be replicated on anything other than a generational time frame anywhere else in the world, even if the global order were to hold. So the question is, can you keep up? We face a bottleneck. We don't have enough heavy sour. We have way too much light sweet, which actually enforces this. And we will always have too much natural gas. So can we build out our petrochemical system to take advantage of these disconnects? So let's look at the inputs. Primary industrial commodity is iron ore. Here are our conflict zones. The green are areas where it comes from, the red are areas that it goes to. You will notice that there's no disruption in the production zones. Roughly 3/4 of the world's iron ore comes from 2 southern hemispheric powers, Australia and Brazil. No problem there. But here's where the steel's forged. Germany, Russia, Ukraine, South Korea, China, Japan. Those are the world's 6th largest producers and exporters of steel. They're all in the conflict zones. Which means, in this country, if you want to avoid complete and utter steel shortages, there's only one solution. You have to find new places to put the steel together, new foundries. Once you have the iron ore, what's the single largest limiting factor in forging steel? Power. Who's got the cheapest power in the world? Right here. Heavy industry, all of it, is coming back because you can run this for almost any industrial commodity, whether it's rare earths or aluminum, and the pattern pretty much holds. Let's talk manufacturing. When you're talking about multi-step manufacturing systems, no country can do it completely by themselves. So what I've done here is put together the numbers for where the various components that go into American manufacturing. The greens are ones that in this new global disorder that we're facing aren't going to face significant disruptions. When you get into yellow, you're probably talking about 1/4 of it being disrupted, and when you're talking orange, probably half. It isn't a perfect picture, but there's a lot of green up there and a fair amount of yellow. These are the sort of disruptions that, given a few years, the United States market, the NAFTA market in particular, can work its way around. That's not the case in Europe. The German system is far more integrated with foreign countries than the American system, both as a percentage of the overall value added and in the exposure that they face. Once you start getting into those red arrows, you're talking about 3/4, if not more, disruption. The German manufacturing model will not hold in its current system. Even if demographically they were able to retrain, and they're not going to be able to have the trade access to continue being the Germany that we know. And that's nothing compared to what's going to happen in East Asia. Try as the Chinese might, they simply have not turned the corner. And they are way too dependent upon technology imports and other manufactured systems that they can't replicate themselves. So even if the demographics argued for them, even if the capital structure argued for them, even if trade access argued for them, somebody like Lighthizer, who has a really bad hair day, can bring down the entire Chinese manufacturing system. And then the final piece I want to talk about is labor. Now, this is my global stability map. Blue countries are the ones that are going to rule the future. They can't screw it up even if they tried, and some of them will try oh so very hard. Green's still looking pretty good. Yellow and brown is where things start to fall apart. The countries in yellow have something going for them. Maybe they're self-sufficient in energy or food, or their population is uniquely unified to face the challenges of the future. They're still going to probably lose more fights than they win, but they're going to hang in there. Browns, no. The Browns are utterly dependent upon the global system in its current form as maintained by the Americans, and they lack the power demographically, economically, financially, militarily to impose a new system, even in their own neighborhood, that will survive more than a few years. And then the Reds, those are the failed states. I'm going to zoom in now on Eurasia. And those hashes, that's the world's skilled labor pool. Anytime that you are someone with a portable degree and some financial assets, and you find yourself in a yellow, brown, or red country, you get out. Now, the last time something like this went down, it was the 1840s and 50s. We had the German Civil Wars. We had the largest wave of migration to the New World that we have ever seen. One of the reasons there's so many Germans in Illinois and Texas is because of this factor. We're going to see that happen again. Now think about what that does to the world. We're going to be in an environment where there's going to be absolute labor shortages around the world and absolute consumption shortages around the world, and then we're going to see brain drain to the United States on a scale that we have not seen in 150 years. Now, for those of you who are Gen Xers or Boomers, this is kind of cool, because it means you're going to be able to hire a 50-something German engineer who knows how to do everything in his or her sector for peanuts. Or you could hire a sandal-wearing, scooter-riding millennial who thinks he's going to have your job in 3 years. Your choice. All right, I think that's plenty to think about for now. If you're finding yourself in need of a doorstop or maybe a coaster, accidental is where it all started, how the world came to be in the shape that it is today, the international crises that Americans are most likely to care about. Absent picks up with the shale revolution, plays it forward, shows how it's remaking the American industrial experience and the wars that will erupt around the world as a result. Disunited Nations comes out in February, and it goes through the countries of the future, the ones that will actually be able to do very well in the chaos to come. We've got about 15 minutes for questions, so fire them off. Go ahead.
Do you have a question? Oh, you just raised your hand.
No. Just put your hands up. We've got microphones roving.
Quentin Smith with Aviva. That was very interesting. How does the nascent AI, machine learning, industrial 4.0, and that disruption play into all this labor-centric world you outlined?
I'm glad that you referred to it correctly, machine learning. AI is one of those terms that makes us all think of Skynet. We have seen no capacity from Silicon Valley and no claims from Silicon Valley that machines can think, or that they're going to be able to think within the next 40 years. So they're not going to be able to pass the logic test of a 2-year-old anytime soon. Machine learning is absolutely what's going on. It's the optimization of a binary decision point. And that will still have significant gains for us in finance and manufacturing and everything else. The biggest impact you are going to see in the next 15 years is on optimization of supply chains, not from a security point of view, but from a number of supply chain steps point of view. Because the new manufacturing techniques, especially things like additive manufacturing, mean that we're going to be able to make a car with, instead of 30,000 pieces, with 2,000 pieces. And that means this long, gangly manufacturing structure that we become used to all of a sudden gets a lot shorter. And because of what's going on with machine learning, it's going to require a different skill set of the type that first world countries, as a rule, are better at. So these gangly, continent, ocean-spanning supply chain systems, those are going to go away because of AI, even before we start thinking about changes with insurance and transport and security. So it kind of rolls into there as a general reinforcing trend for a lot of what I'm discussing here.
Tracy Griffith with Worley. Hi.
You wave. Hi.
Last year at ECC, we had a presenter that talked about alternative energies disrupting some of these futuristic geopolitical plans.
Sure.
As well as the millennials and others' perspective on green energy and alternative to petrochemicals. How does that factor into some of your equations and thoughts?
Sure. Full disclosure, I'm personally a green. I've got solar panels on my house. They just got activated this morning. I'm really excited to see what happens to my power bill. In most places, it doesn't work. If you look at a map of solar radiation and wind intensity, and you look where everything overlaps and where it works and where it doesn't, there's only about 7 countries on the planet that can appreciably get more than, 20, 25% of their power from current green technologies. The United States, being the first world power that is closest to the equator, is on that list. Denmark, Australia, South Africa, United Kingdom, Argentina, those are some of the others. And that's about it. In most places, we have discovered that if you go with today's technology, you're actually increasing your carbon footprint, because you will never be able to generate enough electric power from solar panels to pay back the cost of producing them in the first place. That is certainly the case in places like Canada and Germany. I mean, no offense to any Germans in the room, but the sun does not shine in your country. Why in the world would you put up solar panels? And so they've put up about €1.5 trillion of infrastructure. Their power bills have increased by a factor of 5, and their carbon emissions have increased. So ideology is nice if the technology is ready to support it. And in most places, that is not the case. Now, the interesting thing for people in this room is that most of you are in Texas, and that's one of the few places in the world where it works. The Great Plains are great for wind. West Texas is great for sun. The first U.S. metro city of size to go fully 100% renewable is going to be Dallas-Fort Worth. And I don't think there are any environmentalists in Dallas-Fort Worth. They're doing it because they like free things, and it makes sense there. But you're just not going to see. You'll see the wave of technology and regulation going around the world. No argument there. It's just not going to work in most places. Until we figure out the storage side of the equation, and we know it's not lithium, we really can't move past 20 to 25 anywhere. We got one up here.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Dwayne Boudreau with RefChem, Burns & McDonnell Company. So we have Robert Lighthizer, chief negotiator, working for a guy that wrote The Art of the Deal. How's this play out? Our stock market, a lot of volatility, yet we're still double compared to when he took over. How's this play out over the next, let's say, 6 years?
Okay. I'm glad you said 6 years instead of 6 months. Yeah, tactical stock stuff, I don't do that. Lighthizer is the guy who wrote the WTO charter, so he knows exactly where to put the knives in order to cause as much pain for whoever's across the table as possible. He's done a fairly good job of it. Lighthizer is also the only person in the Trump administration that Trump actually gives leeway and free rein to. There's an incredible amount of trust between those two. Probably a year from now, Lighthizer will be the only member of Trump's cabinet who was there at the beginning. Everybody else has been cycled out. So Korea, that one is already done and ratified. Mexico and Canada, that will be ratified later this year. Japan was just completed, will probably be ratified later this year. The United Kingdom negotiations are going to be a little more interesting because Lighthizer first has to break the British will to live before he signs the deal, but that won't take any more than 8 months. That's all of them. The rest of it, everything else that is on Lighthizer's plate is sheer fun. So he can't wait to treat the Chinese like he really wants to. He just wants to get the British thing taken care of first. And then the European Union is next. So we're going to see a broad breakdown in trade relations in the best case scenario across both oceans. That's assuming all these other issues that I've been discussing don't overtake events. But we are looking at the collapse of the global order from both an institutional point of view and a day-to-day economic point of view. So if you are one of those companies that still has a lot of manufacturing in China, I mean, A, you've got to assume at this point that every technical secret you have has already been stolen. B, as soon as the extradition law in Hong Kong goes formal, the Chinese are going to start arresting executives, foreign executives, because the extradition law doesn't just apply to mainlanders or to Chinese citizens in Hong Kong, it applies to everyone. And third, if you can even put up with that, you're going to have to start actively participating in Chinese propaganda on everything, regardless of if it deals with the Chinese military, the American military, things like Tiananmen Square, whatever it happens to be. That is going to be the bar that you're going to have to pass to remain a presence in the People's Republic. So with that sort of risk, I mean, it's not even about reputation at this point. It's about whether or not your companies can even function as a national, or as a global whole. We're going into a renationalization of the global trading network. Samsung has given us an incredible insight as to how you can do that. Samsung used to be one of the countries that was, or companies, excuse me, that was most invested in the mainland China. And then there was a nationalist spat between South Korea and China about 2012. And Samsung started diversifying away. 5 years on, less than 1 in 10 of their inputs actually come from the mainland anymore. So it can be done. It can be done quickly, but it does require a certain mindset shift. Something to consider is that most independent studies say that today, because of cost increases in China, regulatory increases in China, and especially the demographic change in China, you can build most things outside of China for the same price that you can build them inside once you have paid for the sunk cost of the industrial development. And I realize that that number is not 0. But this is not a broad-scale economic collapse. In the next 6 years, your time frame, this process, at least as far as North America is concerned, is going to be completed because the capital is there, the labor structure is mostly there, and the skilled labor structure is going to be coming anyway. So we're going to get through this. It's not a straight line. There are a lot of bumps along the way, and Donald Trump loves his Twitter account. But over the long term, this looks pretty good. And we're done.
Thank you so much, Peter. Really appreciate it. Here's a little gift
All right.
from the board. And yeah, it's got some weight to it. Peter's going to be sticking around during our network break, so if you have any more questions, feel free to find him. He's one of the tallest people here, so you shouldn't be too big of a problem. We will meet back in this room at 9:50 for our next featured speaker, so enjoy the networking break.
All right.